Hi. So thank you very much. We are returning from the lunch, and thank you for your audience. And well, so we will start now our panel 6. Before, I will just remind you to follow us in the social medias with the hashtag Climate and Labor 2023. Also, we will have speakers now in English, Portuguese, and French. So it's a very international panel. So if you don't understand any language, please grab a handset for translation. And also, who is attending online, please select your preferred language in the YouTube channel. Sorry, YouTube, no, sorry, Zoom channel, sorry. And so also reminding you who are following the conference online, please don't forget to fill the questionnaire, and the link is on the chat. And also for people that are here, please don't forget to submit your suggestions and your opinion in the QR code that are fixed on the walls, on the lateral walls. Thank you very much. So we are starting our last panel, and then after that we will have our closing session with Professor Mendes. And so our last panel will be led, our last panel, sorry, it's about climate change and inequalities. To guide us in this discussion, I would like to call Professor Catarina Frade. She's Associate Professor, it's a little bit, she's Associate Professor of Law at the Faculty of Economics at the Universidade de Coimbra and permanent researcher at Center for Social Studies. She has a law degree from the Faculty of Law, Universidade de Coimbra, master and PhD in economics from here, the Faculty of Economics at University of Coimbra. Her research interests include regulation and risk, consumption, household indebtedness and over-indebtedness, corporate insolvency, and restructuring and services innovation. Thank you very much, Catarina, to guide us on this discussion. And please, go ahead. Thank you.
Agora sim. Obrigada, Maria. Muito boa tarde a todas e a todos. É com muito gosto que estou aqui a participar nesta iniciativa do Centro Pulitzer, a quem agradeço o convite, nesta organização conjunta com a Faculdade de Economia e com o Centro de Estudos Sociais. Cabe-me fazer a moderação deste 6º painel que tem como título as alterações climáticas e as desigualdades, e com um especial ênfase nas desigualdades do ponto de vista dos trabalhadores, da força de trabalho, mas não apenas essas desigualdades. Eu vou fazer uma breve introdução aos membros deste painel, prestigiados membros deste painel, seguindo a ordem das respectivas apresentações. Começo pela apresentação da pessoa que está à minha esquerda, Susan Schulman, bem-vinda. Trata-se de uma conhecida e premiada vídeo e fotojornalista que tem percorrido um pouco o mundo nas regiões mais difíceis do planeta para nos trazer, enquanto jornalista, a voz daqueles que muitas vezes não chegam às primeiras páginas da imprensa mundial. percorrendo o extenso trabalho que tem desenvolvido há mais de 30 anos, podemos encontrar abordagens a temas tão variados, mas todos eles muito associados às desigualdades, como que sejam as questões das alterações climáticas, que é o tema que nos traz aqui hoje nesta conferência, mas também relacionadas com a segurança alimentar, a segurança tout court das pessoas em contextos de conflito e, portanto, é um privilégio ter aqui alguém que nos traz, por exemplo, a experiência dos agricultores de algumas regiões que têm percorrido e do modo como as alterações climáticas estão a forçá-los a abandonar não só as práticas ancestrais que faziam e que moldam a sua cultura e a sua identidade, mas também a trajetória que os leva a mudarem para espaços urbanos com os quais não têm raízes e com os quais têm de aprender a interagir numa esperança que veremos na sua apresentação se será ou não uma esperança vã de conseguirem uma integração e uma pertença. Tenho depois ao meu lado direito, começando pela a pessoa que está mais próxima de mim, peço perdão, começarei pelo Boaventura porque será o segundo palestrante. Boaventura Monjane trata-se de um jornalista e ativista moçambicano que fez o seu doutoramento na Universidade de Coimbra, no Centro de Estudos Sociais, e hoje está a realizar um pós-doutoramento no Instituto de Estudos Agrários, eu peço desculpa porque só com os óculos, no Instituto para a Pobreza, a Terra e os Estudos Agrários da Universidade do Cabo Ocidental, na África do Sul, e que tem também dedicado boa parte da sua atividade de investigação e de ativismo social ao tema dos movimentos sociais em contexto agrário, à política agroecológica, à soberania alimentar e à justiça climática. Seja bem-vindo também estamos certamente muito expectantes de ouvir também a sua experiência junto da atividade, junto dos movimentos sociais e a forma como vivem, experienciam e ao mesmo tempo conduzem e lutam pela defesa da manutenção da identidade, da manutenção das culturas de grupos populacionais, no sentido de manter um aspecto que hoje também está ameaçado, que não é apenas a ameaça da diversidade das espécies vegetais e da fauna, mas também a própria diversidade das culturas, dos grupos humanos que sofrem diretamente e que se veem ameaçados por estes contínuos processos de afetação das condições climáticas, de esgotamento dos recursos naturais das quais dependem a sua vida, a sua sobrevivência e, como dizia há pouco, também a sua identidade, o seu modo de vida, aquilo que os define. E tenho finalmente aqui junto a mim a Malungu, do Centro Pulitzer e também responsável pela comunicação no âmbito do Centro para a Bacia do Congo e que também, enquanto jornalista, tem procurado estabelecer as pontes entre a linguagem jornalística e a defesa do ambiente e do modo de vida das populações, especialmente das mais vulneráveis. Seja também muito bem-vinda e vamos ouvir também, com muito agrado, certamente, a apresentação que vai fazer. Finalmente, temos também aqui um quarto palestrante que, infelizmente, por razões imprevistas, não pôde estar aqui hoje presencialmente como desejaria. Trata-se de Ashok Bharti, que está, penso eu, na Índia, e que é conhecido ativista e defensor dos direitos do povo Dalit, que é uma das castas mais vulneráveis, porque também mais desfavorecidas no contexto da Índia, e toda a sua atividade, nomeadamente no âmbito da Confederação Nacional das Organizações Dalit e da Comissão Internacional para a Defesa dos Direitos do Povo Dalit, tem sido defensor muito ativo do reconhecimento e da inclusão e da dignificação dos direitos desta casta da sociedade indiana. Ele juntar-se-á a nós através de um vídeo e, portanto, também aqui ficam as boas-vindas, sendo ele o último a intervir. E sem mais delongas, irei então passar a palavra à primeira oradora, Susan Schulman. The floor is yours. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Katerina, and pleasure to be with you all today. Sorry. And I would like to, let me just advance this. Oops, why isn't it going?
Okay.
Sorry.
Yes.
Ah. Oh. Sorry, I was pushing the forward button. Oh. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. It's there.
Try to change. No.
No.
Yes.
Ah, all right, here we are. Sorry about that, everybody. Okay, so I've been to Iraq twice in the past 2 years, and the first time I went, I was investigating the impact of water scarcity and inevitably drought on those people in Iraq who are most affected, which are obviously the farmers, because obviously farmers live so close to nature that any changes that they register, that are registered, happen through them. So first, I'd like to show you the impact of that as I take you through sort of the trajectory of the impact of climate change as experienced by those immediately affected. So these are some pictures that come from Iraq, starting in the south and going up all the way to the north. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. Okay. So I went and I did this, and what I discovered were that farmers were unable to stay on their farms. So of course, then after that, I wanted to go back and see what lives they had established for themselves, what new lives they were able to find for themselves once they had moved into the cities. So here we are. These are the very famous Al Hawiza marshes, which are no longer capable of supporting the lives of people who have been there for generations. This is in Suleimania, near Suleimania in the north. And the farm she's looking out on is her husband's farm, and they're about to leave it, and it's going to absolutely devastate him, she said. This is another man in the Al Hawiza marshes, and his comment was, no one will be here next year if there's no more rain. And the level of the water, as you can see there, is intensely shallow. It should be covering that whole area. And this man is a farmer and a teacher as well. So as rainfall has diminished and hot weather has become hotter, which in Iraq, in particular in the south, means that the occasional 50°C that they had in the summer, now they're having weeks, prolonged periods of time where the temperature is 50 degrees. So what's happened is the water sources have dried up, land has ceased to be capable of producing the crops or sustaining the livelihood on which farmers are dependent. So Iraq has already lost 39% of its agricultural land to desertification. And that has forced tens of thousands of farmers from their farms. And this man's interesting because he's experienced it from two angles. As a farmer, those are his dates. You know, this is like a famed date region in the world. It used to be anyway. And this is the result of this desertification and the drought that he's getting. But also, as the seismic effects of climate change resonate through cities and tens of thousands of farmers are forced to migrate, the schools are becoming overcrowded. And the school that he teaches at, and he's taught there for 35 years, it used to have 25 students, and now the classes have 85. So there's this, you know, kind of ripple effect across society as farmers go from being independent and proud operators, you know, working the land for themselves and their families, to being menial workers, removed from the communities in which they are respected and known, to cities which lack the resources and at times goodwill to accommodate them. And here's another picture which gives you a real sense of the dimension of the desiccation. You see where the boy is on the bicycle on the top left of the frame. That's the level the water used to be at. So, and this is the son of the other man. This is kind of a common sight. And, you know, this is a died of thirst, a cow dead of thirst. I don't know if you can see in the right hand side, in sort of the middle of the frame, slightly in front of the middle, there's a white vertical marker with numbers written on it. That is supposed to measure the level of the river. And you can see that the river, you can barely see the river because it's reduced to a trickle. And this is an important river, well, they all are, because 90% of Iraq's water comes from rivers that originate in Turkey and Iran. And this is powering, it's for hydropower, and it's also for irrigating farms further down. So the numbers of farmers who are being displaced by climate are rising fast. In March 2022, IOM reported that 3,358 families, which translates to 20,148 individuals, were climate and water displaced in a survey which covered only 10 of Iraq's 19 governorates. But by June, the same year, 2022, the number had already grown to 5,767 families, or 34,602 individuals, which is a kind of staggering increase of 72%. But with temperatures in Iraq expected to rise another 2 centigrade by 2050 and rainfall projected to decrease 9% within the same time frame, it's only going to get worse. So this and the impact is absolutely devastating. And I want to kind of talk about that impact on all the levels that it affects. First of all, this is Nabil Aboud. I met him, this is about 60 kilometers south of Basra in Iraq's south. That's his farm. You can see the stunted palms. You don't have to be a farmer to see that that's not in good condition. And he's so heartbroken at having had to leave this farm that he goes back and visits it whenever he can and just walks and sort of laments, and all he's left with basically is memories. But he's also interesting because Nabil, like all the farmers I spoke to, they try so hard to stay, they hang on until it's no longer possible. And the moment it became impossible for Neville really shows the trouble we're in as far as climate goes, because he left when lethal snakes started invading his house in their own desperate search for water. 2 people in the locale had already died having been bitten by these snakes, which were never a problem previously. But in the context of this drought, their watering spots, their food locations have all also, disappeared. So they're invading, or they're coming into houses. So he left. So now here we go into people who have been forced to move, and they end up moving. This is Ahmed Jama, and he's lucky to have that work. It's a day job. It's not even a day job. It's 3 hours. And if he doesn't work, they don't eat. None of them eat. So the impact is just devastating. And the seismic, ructions, they just ripple right across society. So I'd like to talk about some. The psychological impact should not be underestimated. It's a loss of history, a loss of identity. It's the loss of ancestral lands. And to be the one that has lost this through no fault of their own, I might add, is nonetheless absolutely devastating. Anecdotally, although there's no data to back this up, suicide has risen, has gone up. And there's also just a deep connection to the earth that is also just lost. So they go into the city. This is a very common job for a displaced farmer. It's menial labor that they get. He's working in this roundabout in Basra now. And just as you can see, picking up the rubbish and trimming the trees. And he does it lovingly because, it's the only thing that connects him to the greenery that he once knew. They also lose a sense of community. They lose community completely and their place within. And that brings along with it a lack of the respect and the position accorded. Sajad's family was very well known in his area. They were the first people to get the television. His father was the one that mediated all the disputes. People would come to their house and watch, football matches and stuff. I mean, it was a kind of wonderful sort of life. And to bring home what he says after telling me about, he's mired in poverty now. He earns 1/5 of what he earned from farm revenue, which is typical. So they're just absolutely, plummet. But he said, of course, I miss more than my land. I miss my life, my history, my everything. I look at a picture, it makes me so sad. I miss my land. I miss it when it was green. I miss my vegetables, my fruit. It makes me so sad. I hope one day I can go back. I dream about those days. And people are depressed, and family tension is growing as well as a result. This is his wife, Nawali, and I'll talk a little bit more about women toward the end, but for Nawali, it's intensely difficult because women have a role to play on a farm. Here, she's in their room, she can't go out, she has no reason to go out, she has no job, and when she goes out, she told me, she's mocked for her rural accent. So there's a real culture kind of clash that's going on in which women, for the most part, are further marginalized. This is in their little houses. This is the largest cemetery in the entire world. It goes on absolutely forever. It's in Najaf. This is Ali Sabib Hussein. And this is another typical job that the once proud farmers are forced to assume, which is looking after selling holy water and incense at the cemeteries. This is him. And you can see what he says. I used to be among the living, and now I'm among the dead. Those are all tombs behind him. But when they moved to the city, they lack means, they lack connections, plunged into poverty. Families who described their lives as formerly middle class and comfortable are now struggling to make ends meet. They are also blamed for escalating crime, illegal houses, which they build on the fringes on land which belongs to the town, overcrowding of schools, straining already scarce resources, the tapping off electricity and all the rest of it. And as such, they're threatening social cohesion, the migration of them into the city. They're forming a new underclass, to quote a Najaf city official, and increasing social stratification. This, of course, feeds social grievance and unrest. So we're talking about a very dangerous cycle, which this is the way he lives now. And this is a good hour from where he has set up his kiosk. This is Najad Maji, and she's 45. She too is from a farm family and has lived her whole life on the farm. And same as the others, drought and desiccation have, oh, sorry. Oh, 1 minute. Okay, sorry. Okay. All right. So she's set up this business doing this. Okay. So, all right. Here's some others, and I will just, okay. So the reason I've put this couple in, okay, we saw Najad just now. We saw Noali, the wife, she's deprived of her identity, deeply depressed, in conflict with her husband. Naja has set up a business for the first time in her life, having lived on a farm exclusively, far from cities. And she has taken the initiative to set up a business, which is completely unacceptable to her conservative family, and which is why she covers herself up so no one can recognize her. But she takes no pride in what she's done, even though I think we would take pride in what she's done. This woman, Leila, her husband was earning too little to survive on in this job that looking after a disused solar plant. She insisted she had to work, and it completely has changed her worldview. Before, she would never have thought girls or women should work, she said. Now she is so proud, and he's proud. So we have 3 different examples of women. Finally, in the last 30 seconds, I want to point out the fact that climate is very often approached, as I have done here in this talk, in the context of that particular country or situation which is being explored. And I think what that does is that it glosses over the fact that it is leading to insecurity, and it's a destabilizing factor, not just within national borders, but internationally. And while we are aware of this, to a certain extent with the migrants who come over to Europe, it's still not really quantified in terms of what that's, which ones of those migrants are actually climate. But the other thing I wanted just to quickly point out was that it also exposes the international aspect in terms of dams. The kiss of death for many of these farmers who were already hanging on by a thread are the dams in Turkey and Iran. Both countries, both Turkey and Iran, also are coping with climate change and with restive populations that are as aggravated and in some cases caused by climate change and the lack of water, for example, in Turkey, where the farmers demonstrated. So dams are something that's very, very important and critical. And just finally, I was recently in Mozambique, and in their recent, cyclones and inundation, the dams that that hold that water back couldn't support it. So it was the opposite consequence there. The dams were released and it flooded people's crops away and their homes. So thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you, Susan. And I give the floor to Boaventura Monjane.
Thank you so much, Professor. And I'm so happy to be here back home. I used to sit at that side of the room, and it feels so good to be at this side of the room. And I'm also happy to see friends and former professors listening to me. Can I have that thing? Oh, good. So I would like to first say that I identify myself as a scholar, activist, and journalist. So I have 3 hats. And sometimes I sound like a scholar, but sometimes I sound like an activist, sometimes like a journalist. So you will feel those 3 identities in my presentation. I think that there is no contradiction between those 3 identities and categories. I believe that both journalism and activism, as well as scholarship, can and should work for the transformation of the world towards a better world. I come, is this bottom? Is the middle one? Okay. I come from a region where climate change is having significant impact. We are experiencing increasingly frequent and intense extreme weather events. One of the most significant impacts of climate change in Southern Africa relates to food security. The region is particularly vulnerable to droughts, which leads to crop failures, water shortages, and livestock loss. My own country, Mozambique, was very recently hit by Cyclone Fred in March of this year, which devastated central Mozambique. Not too long ago, my country was hit by one of the worst cyclones in recent history, Cyclone Idai. A few weeks later, after Idai, the northern region of Mozambique, Cabo Delgado, was hit by another cyclone, Cyclone Kenneth. For the first time in recorded history, 2 strong tropical cyclones hit the country in the same season of the year. Idai and Kenneth took more than 1,000 lives, 100 missing, and more than 1,000 were injured. At least 2.5 million people, including 1 million children, were in urgent need of humanitarian assistance in healthcare, nutrition, shelter, education, water, and sanitation. An entire city of Beira was destroyed. More than 250,000 houses were destroyed. Nearly 160,000 people were displaced, and more than 700,000 hectares of food crops were damaged and lost. As an extractive economy, and because of its neoliberal-oriented economic policies, Mozambique has long been a supplier of coal and other carbon-intensive mineral resources to transnational corporations. However, the burning of these resources takes place outside Mozambique, which makes Mozambique to contribute very little to polluting the planet. But the consequences of climate change are felt very strongly in my country, which exacerbates the already existing social and economic inequalities in the country. As a natural tendency of capitalism, the ecological crisis we face is experienced unequally between regions, making regions like Southern Africa and Mozambique in particular as sacrifice zones, like Mariana and Antonio spoke in the morning. It's true that climate change has been fueling poverty among the most exposed workers and groups. In Mozambique, this is true for the majority of those involved in agrarian labor, both employed and self-employed, the peasantry. Despite a gradual decline in labor share in agriculture, 2/3 of the economically active population in Mozambique are small-scale farmers or camponeses. While most of them live in rural areas, nearly a quarter of the economically active population in urban centers also describe themselves as peasant farmers. the so-called extractive industry employs only a tiny portion of the population, mainly because none of these mineral resources are processed in the country. In this talk, I want to argue that not only are the effects of climate change responsible for the creation of poverty, but also the mainstream mechanisms proposed to mitigate and adapt to climate change are responsible for the destruction of people's livelihoods in the South, thus exacerbating inequalities. In other words, mainstream solutions to climate change are actually and potentially responsible for inequality, especially in the countryside in relation to agrarian labor. I'm talking about climate change mitigation projects such as REDD+ and narrow conservation projects and adaptation solutions such as climate smart agriculture and so on. 12 years ago, when in Mozambique, the implementation of the so-called community carbon projects for carbon sequestration were mushrooming, I visited one of the projects that at the time was considered to be a model project in the community of Nyambita at the buffer zone of Gorongosa National Park in central Mozambique. This project had been introduced a few years prior to my visit in Nyambita by a UK-based company called EnviroTrade. In this sense, the company had signed contracts with a significant number of farmers in the community. Some were to patrol and protect the local forest from logging and use of other forest resources by the same Nyambita residents, while others were to plant trees on their own farmlands and residential plots to maximize the carbon sequestration capacity of the project in Nyambita for EnviroTrade to sell through the carbon market mechanism. It's worth noting that under the agreements with the company, 3 growers were not allowed to clear new areas for other activities, including agriculture, as EnviroTrade was interested in documenting larger amounts of vegetation for biomass for the purpose of capturing as much carbon as possible. EnviroTrade's clients were polluting companies and individuals in Europe and the United States. The week I visited Nyambita, Rio+20, the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, was taking place in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And REDD+ projects like the one in Nyambita were being promoted as the right way to go and were highly praised by leaders at the summit, even though climate justice and agrarian movements were calling this type of projects as false solutions to climate change. I wrote a report concluding that the Nyambita carbon project was threatening food security in the region because farmers involved in the project grew less and less food crops in order to prioritize the planting of trees because they received an annual amount, an annual payment based on the amount of trees they could plant and maintain. The more trees planted and the more land used, the higher the annual payment. Thus, not only were their livelihoods and social reproduction strategies disrupted and access to land restricted, but their emissions rights were expropriated. The report also showed how adverse and exploitative that mechanism was, and that a soft land grab was occurring. Although the project was welcomed by many local farmers, there were also many people, including local traditional leaders, who opposed it strongly, claiming that it did not compensate for the exchange of locally produced food crops for the efforts to grow and maintain trees for carbon sequestration. Even among those who joined the project by signing the contracts, there were some who broke the contract in the middle of the night, cutting protected trees from the forest to open up new fields for subsistence farming to combine both strategies, farming and engaging in carbon sequestration business. Many others simply abandoned the project. Due to the fall in the global price of carbon, and the consequent financial infeasibility of the project, the company had to stop its operation and end the project, leaving the farmers perplexed, disillusioned, and revolted. In 2018, the company left the region, leaving behind unfulfilled contractual obligations, including monetary debts to contracted farmers. In the uncertainty of whether envirotrade would return to give them jobs or pay off debts, the number of those who not only no longer cared about the maintenance of the trees, but also cut them down to make room for the reintroduction of food crops to increase productivity was growing. Almost a decade and a half later, Nyambita's farmer became poorer. Due to time constraints, I will not elaborate on how the enforcement of so-called climate-smart agriculture is also highly problematic, including the imposition of genetically modified seeds and other capitalist farming inputs into agrarian societies in Southern Africa. This, of course, is this type of mitigation mechanisms is part of what is called green extractivism. Before concluding on what I think needs to be done to reduce inequality while addressing the climate crisis, I would like to say a few words about another trend that is already showing signs of worsening inequality in Southern Africa. The new scramble for the so-called rare earth and green metal needed to the so-called just transition or transition to low carbon economy. A new scramble for critical transition minerals is unfolding, which is reinforcing the neocolonial international division of labor with the South remaining the supplier of cheap raw materials and labor, while transnational corporations are positioning themselves to earn enormous profits. Mining affected and peasant communities, rural women and workers are confronted with dispossession, loss of control over their natural resources, worsening conditions of work, and ecological destruction. The rush to mine those resources, copper in Zambia, cobalt in the Republic Democratic of Congo, lithium in Zimbabwe, graphite in Mozambique, and so on, will lead to the erosion of labor and livelihood opportunities for communities and agrarian laborers. I call this green grabbing. So what needs to be done? In Southern Africa, social movements and I forgot to show you slides. In Southern Africa, social movements and popular formations are calling for land, agrarian, and climate justice. This includes land democratization and fair agrarian structures. This includes implementation of land redistribution and passing of agrarian policies that are pro-poor. Implementation of alternatives to industrial capitalist agriculture, such as agroecology, food sovereignty, and democratization of technologies. Passing of policies to transition to a low carbon development path, reflecting the voices of social movements and labor formations, articulate the economic policies, be it fiscal, monetary, trade, industrial, etc., required to enable a transition that addresses ecological destructions and socioeconomic inequalities. In other words, a just transition from below. The right for communities to say no to green extractivism and the right to set the terms under which their resources can be mined. This implies that the power of mining transnational corporations has to be dismantled and their architecture of impunity ended, and if possible, be left behind. Thanks.
Obrigada. Thank you, Boaventura, for your very accurate presentation and provocative. Thank you. And I'll give the floor to Afi Malungu.
Thank you so much. I will present in French. Those who didn't get the opportunity to grab a headset, please do. It will be quite interesting. And something else is interesting is that his presentation is kind of not an introduction, but the first part of mine. It is actually the same situation. So let's go for the French part of the conference. Ma présentation va tourner autour du climat, les inégalités et la déforestation. Et je vais commencer par souligner le fait que la sensibilisation a un rôle important à jouer dans l'éveil des consciences pour agir contre le changement climatique. Et une sensibilisation qui favorise les échanges d'idées, d'opinions et d'expériences entre différents acteurs ayant un objectif commun, à cette capacité d'inspirer, d'encourager, de corriger et même de perfectionner les actions que nous menons, tous en faveur de la lutte contre le changement climatique. Dans cette présentation, je vais raconter comment une session d'échange et de sensibilisation contre la déforestation auprès des jeunes professionnels en République démocratique du Congo a abouti à une campagne de sensibilisation sur le climat et le travail. Dans le contexte de la déforestation dans le bassin de Congo, et plus particulièrement en RDC, je vais introduire mon propos par ces trois choses. D'abord, l'agriculture sur brûlis est souvent mise en avant comme la première cause de la déforestation des forêts en RDC, selon certaines narratives, en faisant des communautés les principaux acteurs de la déforestation. Également, la forêt est le moyen de survie de millions de personnes en RDC qui en dépendent pour assurer leurs moyens de survie. Le changement climatique, à son tour, vient exacerber autant la déforestation que les conditions de travail de ces communautés qui ne vivent et ne dépendent que de la forêt. Nous savons aussi que les populations dépendantes des forêts sont conscientes et témoins des changements qui occurrent dans leur environnement, et ces changements sont également aggravés par la pauvreté, l'insécurité alimentaire, parmi tant d'autres conséquences. Et de par son contexte politique, économique et social, les communautés se tournent vers les ressources forestières pour maintenir leurs moyens de subsistance, très souvent par manque d'alternatives adaptées à leur réalité. Ces assumptions ne sont pas nouvelles pour la majorité d'entre vous qui connaissent plutôt bien le secteur environnemental. Alors, je vais commencer mon récit sur comment une sensibilisation contre la déforestation a abouti à une campagne sur le climat et le travail. Alors, en 2022, le Pulitzer Center a lancé le programme International Education and Outreach, IEO, et l'initiative en Afrique centrale a plutôt visé comme cible principale les jeunes professionnels dans sa partie de la sensibilisation. Et nous avons visé en fait les hommes et les femmes d'entre 25 et 45 ans qui exercent une activité professionnelle officielle ou non officielle, ou encore une activité génératrice de revenus. C'était dans le but de les informer et leur présenter les bénéfices qu'ils peuvent tirer de la protection des forêts. Nous sommes partis en fait des résultats d'une enquête d'audience au préalable qui avait démontré que leur faible intérêt pour les questions climatiques et la déforestation était dû au manque d'informations sur l'intérêt de ces jeunes aux questions forestières et surtout de leur préservation. Ainsi, l'initiative qui s'appelle Congo Basin Talks with Young Professionals consiste à utiliser les plateformes d'échange et de discussion que les jeunes utilisent déjà pour s'exprimer et discuter entre eux. Et nous les sensibilisons sur la problématique de la déforestation, l'importance de leur implication et les avantages qu'ils peuvent tirer à s'engager à sa préservation en termes de carrière, de plaidoyer, de recherche d'entrepreneuriat ou encore dans la gestion de l'État. En septembre 2012, dans le cadre de cette initiative, nous avions organisé une conférence débat à Lubumbashi, dans la région du Grand Katanga au sud-est de la RDC, qui a réuni les jeunes professionnels évoluant dans le secteur agricole, les médias, les droits humains, autour de la question de la dualité entre la déforestation et l'insécurité alimentaire et de quelle manière les jeunes pouvaient s'investir pour y lutter. Lors de cette conférence, nous avions abordé notre thème sur le reportage du journaliste Didier Macal, qui est actuellement boursier du Rainforest Investigative Network, Agrarian, du Pulitzer Center. Il a produit un récit sur la déforestation dans la cité de Kalamba, une cité de 40 000 habitants, où les agriculteurs de maïs, de haricots et d'arachides coupent les arbres de la forêt afin de gagner des terres arables. Le reportage était financé par le programme Rainforest Journalism Fund, RJF, De son reportage, en fait, les agriculteurs à qui il a échangé lui ont donné 3 raisons principales pour lesquelles ils doivent recourir à la forêt pour assurer leurs moyens de survie. La première est la perturbation des saisons, avec comme conséquence à la fois la rareté des pluies sur une longue durée et de fortes précipitations sur une durée qui est courte. La deuxième raison est la sécheresse dans la région, également avec l'avancée du désert de Kalahari dans toute l'Afrique australe, et aussi la difficulté d'accès à la terre, car l'État congolais, en fait, applique le favoritisme au bénéfice des entreprises minières qui exploitent le cobalt et le cuivre. Donc, c'est-à-dire que lorsque un agriculteur a besoin d'acheter ou bien de louer de la terre pour ses cultures, l'État congolais, en fait, préfère réserver cette terre au cas où une entreprise minière viendrait faire la demande, car nous le savons très bien, les mines rapportent beaucoup plus que l'agriculture. Alors, à ce stade-là, vu les raisons que les agriculteurs ont avancées, on peut déjà constater qu'il y a inégalité dans l'accès, l'adoption et la mise en œuvre des politiques d'adaptation au changement climatique, et aussi il y a inégalité d'accès aux terres arables, car ces agriculteurs subissent de la concurrence injuste des entreprises minières qui, dans la quasi-totalité, sont des entreprises établies dans le monde occidental. Selon eux, même l'achat d'intérêts dans cette région de forte concentration minière, c'est de l'or. Alors, face à ces défis, les agriculteurs se tournent vers la forêt. Ils coupent la forêt et ils utilisent l'espace de la forêt pour y planter leurs cultures d'haricots, de maïs et d'arachides, qui finiront ensuite par subir les perturbations des saisons, la rareté des pluies et également la sécheresse. Alors, dans tout cela, le rendement agricole demeure quand même faible. Et ce faible rendement, additionné aux conditions de travail des agriculteurs et le niveau d'effort, sans oublier la pénibilité, font fuir les jeunes de la région qui préfèrent travailler dans les mines qui payent mieux que l'agriculture. Donc, en plus de tous ces défis climatiques d'accès à la terre, il y a également diminution de la main-d'œuvre agricole dans la région. Mais d'un autre côté, ces cultures de maïs et de haricots ne sont pas suffisantes pour assurer la sécurité alimentaire de la population de cette région du sud-est de la RDC, car il y a une forte dépendance aux importations de maïs en provenance de la Zambie. D'ailleurs, un ami scientifique m'a envoyé une nouvelle. Il dit que la Zambie a stoppé l'exportation de sa farine de maïs tant vers la RDC que le Kenya à cause d'une faible pluviométrie causée par la montée du désert du Kalahari et certaines zones ayant des débordements des eaux, ce qui ne favorise pas une bonne productivité. Ça veut simplement dire que, vu que la Zambie prévoit d'avoir un faible rendement dans leur culture de maïs, ils ont stoppé l'exportation vers la Zambie et le Kenya et ils préfèrent garder leur maïs pour eux pour nourrir leurs propres habitants. Comment les blâmer en fait? Et nous voyons aussi qu'il ressort clairement le lien entre la déforestation, le climat et le travail dans ce contexte. Et cette situation sévit dans toute la région du sud-est de la RDC et pas seulement à Kalamba, la localité qui a 40 000 habitants. Alors, là, j'ai parlé d'un événement qui s'est passé en septembre 2022. Parmi, en fait, les recommandations des jeunes, parce que nous parlons d'une conférence débat avec les jeunes professionnels, les jeunes ont recommandé de mener des sensibilisations sur les réalités que vivent les agriculteurs et les communautés. Et ces réalités climatiques les obligent à couper la forêt pour assurer leurs moyens de survie. Et cela permettrait en fait d'informer, de sensibiliser et d'initier des actions ou des décisions en leur faveur, avec comme résultat de préserver la forêt tout en assurant la survie des communautés vivant autour des forêts. Et cette recommandation est à l'origine en fait d'une activité en cours au Pulitzer Center, en RDC plus particulièrement, et l'activité s'appelle Communities Climate Stories, qui consiste en fait à donner une plateforme aux communautés pour raconter leur réalité, les changements observés et les défis qu'ils rencontrent dans l'exercice de leurs activités professionnelles ou génératrices de revenus face au changement climatique et aux pratiques actuelles. Et ces récits, en fait, seront recueillis par les professionnels des radios communautaires évoluant dans leur milieu et produits sous forme de podcasts. Et ces podcasts feront partie, en milieu de l'année, d'une campagne en ligne globale planifiée pour informer et sensibiliser les jeunes sur le risque climatique que leur présent et avenir professionnel en cours, mais également pour inspirer des chercheurs, des journalistes, la société civile, les mouvements et également les associations des travailleurs à mener des actions en faveur de l'égalité dans le contexte particulier du climat et du travail. Mais je tiens quand même à assurer que ces podcasts ne sont pas des récits ou encore des reportages journalistiques. Pour conclure, nous aimerions souligner que les activités que nous menons à ce jour, bien que se concentrant jusque-là sur la sensibilisation à la préservation des forêts tropicales, a permis aux questions cruciales mises en lumière par les récits journalistiques d'être exploitées au travers des interactions par des jeunes confrontés à des journalistes, des chercheurs, des académiques, des membres de la société civile et aussi des décideurs politiques. Il demeure important en fait d'encourager ces espaces d'échange pour découvrir des interconnexions inattendues, comme c'est le cas avec la déforestation, le climat et le travail pour le cas de Kalamba que nous venons d'exposer. Aussi, lors de nos activités, les jeunes professionnels ont pu participer à des discussions à travers des émissions de radio interactives, les réseaux sociaux et les conférences débats. Et ils ont également pu promouvoir leurs compétences, leurs initiatives, ce qui a permis d'élargir leur réseau. Et finalement, à partir de ces plateformes que l'on a établies, les jeunes professionnels, en fait, ils ont pu atteindre un public national pour mettre en lumière leurs problématiques essentielles. En conclusion, je dirais que l'interconnexion entre le climat et le travail existe partout. Et cela se manifeste partout dans le monde. Partout là où il y a effet du changement climatique, on trouve forcément l'impact du changement climatique sur le travail et les travailleurs. Il n'y a pas des impacts plus forts dans une région ou encore dans une autre. Et le travail consiste l'essence même de la vie et de l'être humain, car l'être humain dépend du climat et dépend aussi de son travail. Alors, je recommande d'observer, d'informer, d'échanger pour trouver cette interconnexion et mettre en place des actions interdisciplinaires. Merci.
Merci, Alfi. Merci, Afi. Muito obrigada e vamos de seguida ter a última das apresentações deste painel, a apresentação da Ashok Bharti, que nos gravou um vídeo para fazer também aqui para marcar aqui a sua presença. Eu peço então à organização, por favor, de dar início à apresentação.
I'll be speaking on climate change and inequalities. I am Ashok Bharti, Chairman, National Confederation of Dalit and Adivasi Organizations. From 1st January to 30th September in 2022, India had 241 days of extreme weather events. These extreme weather events claimed 2,755 lives, killed 70,000 livestock, destroyed about 500,000 houses, and affected crops in 1.8 million hectares. Who were these who lost life, livestock, and houses? We estimate that overwhelmingly of them were lower caste and poor. India, a land of 4 seasons, has 6 climate regions. All regions face detrimental effect of climate change. Well, what are the key connections between labor and climate rights? Majority of unorganized labor in India are lower caste. Apart from social inequalities, they face extreme working conditions and paid wages hardly decent. Workers employed in agriculture, construction, and transportation, etc., are more vulnerable to climate change. Extreme weather conditions, such as extreme heat and cold, adversely impact their health and right to a healthy environment. 65% of Indian agriculture is rain-fed. 86% farmers are small and marginal. For part of the year, these marginal workers also work as labor. Climate change jeopardize livelihood, reduce crop output, and cause food insecurity. Loss of livelihood and food shortage force them to migrate from rural areas. Labor unions are yet to respond and engage with the adverse impact of climate change. Does climate change exacerbate current inequalities? Certainly it does. All development indicators inform that caste is a major axis of embedded inequality. Historically, Dalit and lower caste were assigned unclean occupations, forcing them in dirty, hazardous, and long duration jobs and without decent wage. In Punjab, they were debarred from buying land. All this perpetuated inequalities and extreme poverty among them. Lower caste use livestock for livelihood, food, nutrition, and as a household capital. Due to heat stress, production and reproduction will reduce. Reduction in feed and fodder will adversely impact their well-being. Their asset base will shrink further. This will certainly exacerbate inequalities. Recently, in Rajasthan, a teacher killed a boy for having water from his pot. Shortage of fresh water may lead to conflict. There is clearly a need of centering citizen rights into climate change strategy. Climate change affects life, livelihoods, and right to healthy environment. However, there is hardly any discussion on interconnectedness of climate change and citizen rights in India. This is partly due to lack of understanding on linkages between climate change and citizen rights. Government of India has established a green tribunal which deals environmental issues. Article 36 to 51 of Directive Principles in Part 4 of Indian Constitution can be used to centering citizen rights in the context of climate change. Article 48A, Part 4 of Constitution directs the state shall endeavor to protect and improve the environment and to safeguard the forest and wildlife of the country. Citizen right groups need to effectively engage and intervene. Social movements can connect human rights and climate crisis. Dalits and lower caste in India have strong and highly influential social movement. Recently, Dalit movement has made significant gains. They organized a successful Bharat Bandh on 2nd April and 9th August in 2018. Dalit movement under NACDAOR compelled the union government and the judiciary to retract from diluting the Prevention of Atrocity Act 1989. But Dalit lack institutional support, institutional structures, mobilization of financial resources. They need capacity building, training in advocacy, policy intervention. This will help them in a big way. Therefore, civil society need to engage, promote, and support them and their movement. Human rights intervention meaningfully focus on abuse of law by police and state. But as climate crisis looming large, human rights movement need to be reoriented and include climate change in its agenda. What should we do? We need robust data system recording demographic details of victims of climate crisis. Victims need effective protection. Effective system will help them in addressing inequalities. There is a need to integrate climate crisis mitigation with existing programs and policies. There is also a need to evolve suitable policies in the light of directive principles of the Constitution. Need to develop resilient structure against climate crisis, drought proofing, building water storage structure, water harvesting structure for recharging depleting water, large scale afforestation on common land and along roads and tracks could be useful. Migrant support system need to be institutionalized. Thank you.
Muito obrigada. Acho que depois destas 4 apresentações, temos aqui muita matéria para refletir e para discutir, e eu abro de imediato o espaço à participação da sala e à participação de todos os que nos seguem remotamente para que coloquem as suas perguntas aos nossos oradores.
Olá. Perdão. Gente, nesses 2 dias a gente ouviu muita coisa boa, né? Muitos pontos que se cruzam, especificamente hoje, e aí eu queria parabenizar também a organização pelos painelistas que são incríveis, né? Mas, especificamente hoje, eu vejo uma interseção muito grande entre os temas, principalmente juventude, principalmente protagonismo, né? Nesse evento onde o foco é a questão climática, a gente entende, não é novidade, não é, né, para ninguém, da importância dessas 3 florestas tropicais no enfrentamento a essa emergência climática, né? Então, na verdade, eu queria fazer uma provocação. Como é que... E aí, de manhã, alguém disse que o Pulitzer tem dinheiro, né? Então, como é que a gente promove, o Pulitzer promove um programa de intercâmbio, uma troca de experiências, troca de iniciativa, troca de tecnologias para jovens, né, que estão hoje, que são ativistas hoje, né, que fazem advocacy ou incidência política, que também estão fazendo comunicação social dentro de seus territórios, com o objetivo de defesa de suas identidades, defesa dos seus territórios, né? Então, minha fala vai nesse sentido. Muito obrigada.
Muito obrigada. Eu penso que poderíamos fazer uma ronda pela sala ou para permitir a colocação de algumas perguntas. Só que sejam breves na colocação das questões.
Okay, so my name is Jonas van Vossel. I'm a postdoctoral researcher on labor and climate at SES. I had a question for all of the panelists, actually. It's about what is the possibility for change and what is the agent of change? Because if we identify climate as an issue of labor, and if it's intimately connected to labor, what are the labor organizations where we have to focus ourselves on in order to change? Because sometimes it seems like to be NGOs or like some kind of, I don't know, some social movements which are not very well articulated. But I mean, we have a whole history of labor struggles. We have a history of 200 years of trade unions, of strikes, this kind of thing. How is this connected with these kind of climate struggles? Okay. Can you give some ideas?
Muito obrigada. Mais questões?
More questions.
Se temos mais duas perguntas, sugeria então que online que fossem colocadas e o painel então poderia responder às 4 questões, se estiverem de acordo.
So one question for Boaventura. How can activism, journalism, and academia work together for a better world? And another question for all the panelists. How is the discussion of climate justice present in the climate and labor intersection? And what are the challenges of bringing this intersection into people's daily lives, especially in the countries of the Global South?
Muito obrigada. Vamos então dar a voz, a palavra aos nossos oradores, começando pela sequência da apresentação. Susan?
Okay, thanks. First, thank you for your questions. First, on the possibility of change and the agents of change, I can only speak in this situation about Iraq. And there are several means for change here, none of which are particularly promising. There's activism, they're the environmental activists, and they're actually threatened. Most of them have had to move out of the regions where they have been based previously, which in this case of the people I'm talking about are in the south, and they've had to move into Kurdistan because of the threats for working on the environment. Another environmental activist I spoke to said to me he never went anywhere without a gun anymore, but he wouldn't show it to me. There are also, I think, civil society movements that are all very small but unconnected that are attempting to change, as well as organizations within the government or who work with the government. But also, I think, quite interestingly enough, I think I have actually the man who I quoted there, Mr. Karar, I have recently heard from him, and he is starting his own movement for change. He's trying to reclaim his farm, and what that is involving is him trying to get the government to subsidize him and to provide him with water. So I think maybe as time goes on, these individuals might organize together to do something. But other than that, the political will seems to be faltering at the level of implementation. And the other question, how is the climate justice? I can't really speak to that.
Okay. Thank you. Susan, Boaventura?
I'll be brief. Actually, I give very brief answers. I think academia can, the importance of academia or scholars is to gather and present evidence, which can inform activism as well. And activists can use that evidence to do political agitation and mobilization. And journalists can provide a platform to influence public opinion. I think that articulation is pretty much clear in my mind. And that has happened in Southern Africa, where these 3 sectors work together, and it has been effective, actually. That's the shortest way I can answer that question. John, I think that it's very difficult to say we have one agent of change. We have multiple agents of change, and in most cases, these agents of change have to come, into alliance. In Southern Africa, trade unions are not the most important forms of organization, because the majority of the population are not formally employed, and the region is not industrialized. So you have a lot of people, the bulk of the population, having land as the main struggles for land appear to be more important and urgent than struggles, trade unionism. So this doesn't mean that trade unions are not relevant. I will never say that, but this means that trade unions cannot achieve change if they do not articulate with other popular formations such as peasant organizations and many people that are not organized in any way, by the way, that actually are not needed by capital. They are redundant to capital. They will never be employed formally, but they can, and they're key to the reproduction of the system, but they're not needed by the system. So I think that there is no one agent of change. There are possibilities and multiple agents of change. And I think that, the concept of the working people, which actually sort of try to make sense of those who actually are working class, those who are employed by industry and so on and so forth, and those who are self-exploited, right? Or they self-exploit themselves by being in the informal sector, by being vendors and so on and so forth. I think the concept of working people, I think, offers more possibilities for an articulation between different agents of change.
Oui, pour continuer sur cette question de qu'est-ce qui pourrait apporter du changement, j'ajouterais que l'accès à l'information, surtout environnementale, est la première porte qui pourrait enclencher du changement, surtout dans les pays du Sud. Et également, mettre en place des initiatives, des moyens, des techniques où, en fait, les gens peuvent partager. Il y a aussi une deuxième chose qui est la recherche scientifique. Je l'ai mentionné dans mon exposé, c'est que, plus particulièrement dans le bassin du Congo, des fois, on parle du changement climatique, la plupart du temps, d'ailleurs, sur des estimations. Ce qu'il nous faut, c'est d'avoir des données qui soient, voilà, nous sommes dans le secteur de la science, on ne peut pas être exact à 100%, mais du moins qui se rapprochent de la vérité afin que nous puissions informer les différentes catégories dans la communauté sur ce qui est vrai, et nous avons besoin d'une information qui soit correcte. Et de par cette information-là, nous pouvons mener des actions de sensibilisation, d'éducation, afin de créer des mouvements qui sont informés et qui pourraient en fait questionner les actions des décideurs et également les actions des acteurs dans le secteur privé. Alors, est-ce qu'il y a cette possibilité pour que le changement climatique et le travail aient une certaine interconnexion? Moi, je pense que, comme je l'ai dit, c'est possible en fait. Tout est possible. Nous devons en fait nous mettre en tête que dans le Sud global, les gens, c'est vrai, il y a la pauvreté, il y a le manque de l'information, mais les gens sont conscients des changements qui surviennent dans leur environnement, mais également, ils sont conscients de ce qu'il faut faire. La plupart du temps, ils n'ont pas les moyens de le faire, et beaucoup plus important, il y a des besoins qui sont beaucoup plus importants que de mener des actions, plaidoyer pour renverser la situation. Par exemple, nous avons parlé du sud-est de la RDC où les gens sont en fait concentrés à assurer leur sécurité alimentaire. Ils doivent faire de l'agriculture pour manger, payer les frais scolaires. Et ces gens, en fait, ne gagnent pas grand-chose. Il arrive qu'ils nous disent que quand est-ce que nous aurons le temps et les moyens de nous consacrer à aller demander aux décideurs ce qu'il faut faire. Ce qu'il faut faire, par contre, par exemple, dans ce que nous faisons au Pulitzer Center, nous sensibilisons à travers les reportages que nous finançons et les actions dans le secteur de l'éducation, dans les universités ainsi que les écoles, et également les actions de sensibilisation envers le grand public. Voilà.
Obrigada. Afi, não sei se o Boaventura queria ainda acrescentar algo.
No, I just realized that I forgot to thank the organizers. It's the last time I speak, so I will not forgive myself. I would like to thank the Pulitzer Center for inviting me, and Jonathan, Bruna, Eric, Flora, and everybody that made it. Thank you so much.
E esta sessão está a encerrar. Vimos aqui como as alterações climáticas são responsáveis tanto por aprofundar e agravar situações de desigualdade pré-existentes. Vimos também como elas causam novas desigualdades. Vimos muitos sinais de preocupação, mas eu acho que também temos de olhar para os sinais de esperança que aqui nos foram transmitidos pelos nossos oradores, seja através das afirmações da aposta nas novas gerações, na sua formação, na sua sensibilização, seja também por algum sinal de esperança na forma como as mulheres também podem, ainda que, como vimos pela apresentação da Susan, ainda há muitas ambiguidades e incertezas, mas também que as mulheres podem ter um papel relevante nessa afirmação do combate às desigualdades e, finalmente, também pela forma como penso que de algum modo perpassou por todos estes discursos, que este combate não se faz apenas de cima para baixo, não se faz com medidas exclusivamente desenhadas longe das comunidades, mas só se pode fazer com elas, a partir delas, em colaboração e em íntima ligação com elas, porque elas têm soluções muito válidas com as quais temos de aprender e tirar partido. Muito obrigada uma vez mais pela vossa presença, muito obrigada a todos os nossos oradores, para quem peço uma última e muito viva salva de palmas e obrigada por estarem aqui conosco.
Just going to take one last second to say thank you to the Pulitzer Center and to encourage what Christine was saying before, for people to look it up and look at the opportunities there. None of this could have happened without the Pulitzer Center. So I want to thank, Christine and John and Jonathan and everyone for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the discussion. It was really, really interesting. Thank you, Katarina, for guiding us, for moderating the panel. Thank you very much.